Stephen King once wrote that nightmares exist outside of logic, and there's little fun to be had in explanations. They're antithetical to the poetry of fear. In a horror story, the victim keeps asking why, but there can be no explanation, and there shouldn't be one. The unanswered mystery is what stays with us the longest, and it's what we'll remember in the end.
People who often have the mediocre displeasure of meeting me know that I love three things: my significant other, heavy metal, and horror media. This wasn't always the case, however. I was terrible at getting past the first date when I was single. My Christian brain was indoctrinated to think metal equals Satan, and that horror games would be too much for me, either for blood and guts, or how it creepily lingers in my mind, causing unwanted nightmares. I would eventually propose to my fiancée, love mosh pits and headbanging to metalcore and death metal, and I would eventually frequently go back to horror media with glee as blood and psychological disturbances enter my mind. Good influences in my life once asked, how did I get here? Or who taught him this? I often ponder how I did get to this point of my mentally wrong self, and that point brought me to my initial playthrough of Remedy's Alan Wake for PC. Before I continue further, I must clarify that Alan Wake is not a horror game in the same way that Silent Hill, Dead Space, or Resident Evil are horror games. They are really not too comparable when thinking about it mechanically or even how they manage the horror. Again, Alan Wake is a shooter wearing an Ice 9 Kills hoodie, and in my daily ritual of meandering through Steam page stores in search of a free game that would hold me over until I began to be inspired to complete a game that I had long since beaten, I stumbled upon a bargain that would later influence how I interacted with horror media forever. Now keep in mind something for me. I needed this horror game to not be a horror game. I needed this to be the shallow end of a pool before I drowned in the psychological sorrows of Silent Hill 2, or ration bullets in Resident Evil, the same way that an accountant manages how much his out-of-touch multi-millionaire executives can afford to lose on a business venture destined to fail. I needed something horror adjacent to ease myself into the otherwise disturbing genre. Alan Wake was a gateway game that led me to realize that horror was the smack I wanted on a regular basis. I wasn't addicted yet, but I would be later on as an adult. I would want to take a hit or two of whatever Remedy was selling. How did this game get me to be a horror fan exactly? There was other creepy media that I enjoyed as a kid, but that didn't do the trick. Why this? I can tell you what: forced engagement. TV and movies are a passive medium after all. One just needs to not pay attention to the scary stuff, and it can be missed rather quickly, and the rest of the story could make less sense for doing so. Books, although active, need your full focus on the content on the page, as you are dependent on how the author elaborates the scene on this content. Again, fail to pay attention to what is in front of you, or fail to understand it, and you miss the chills that run up your spine, and the involuntary fight or flight response is nowhere to be seen. Video games, however, is an active medium requiring your full attention to focus and progress. I needed to be Alan Wake. For context, Alan is an unreliable narrator. He wrote a book with pages later to be scattered across town, where the events written would come to pass if it was destined for those who was mentioned on those pages. He is no longer capable of remembering due to the dark trance he was put under by an ambiguous yet somewhat tangible dark force looming over the town and playing with their lives. In this case, literal darkness. Alan Wake worked for me because I needed to be aware of what Alan was aware of. After all, the player character is both a player and a stand-in for me to experience events of the character myself. I would be limited to what he can deduce, the manuscript pages I would find, and whether I had enough bullets and batteries stocked up to survive the next fight. I connected with Alan because I know as much as he knows at any given moment. As Alan grew to have a dependency on his revolver, I grew just as attached and grew in concern the longer Alan was without bullets nor firearms. In other words, the character and the player became one in mind and purpose. Although I couldn't relate too much in Alan's motivations as a kid, later reflections on my horror baby steps as I grew up allowed me to be more in line with Alan. I grew to be engaged to someone I loved as much as she loved me, and grew through the sense of motivation to do whatever it takes to prevent things from getting in between us. I understood what it meant to be creatively bankrupt and in need of motivation to begin a new project, much like how I was initially starting to write many scripts I feared may never really begin to be finished, due to be stuck in production or needing motivation to continue moving forward, the same way that Alan struggles to continue his career and start the next book. The episodic structure of Alan Wake allows for you to feel the waves of safety and danger as the story progresses. It allows for the story to push you into situations where you need to confront the evils out in the world to achieve the desired goal of the episode. So how does the environment itself push itself and the narrative forward? Every episode starts at the start of a new day where Alan is found in his safest. More often than not, this gives the player a chance to familiarize themselves with the space that they will be encountering danger in later on, or give themselves some sort of narrative justifications for why he is going to be returning to a hostile situation, often going back up to mountain trails or the woods. As soon as the night falls and the sun is no longer shining, its comforting warmth on us is nowhere to be seen, is when the gameplay takes place for us to see the give and take of the world shrouded in darkness. This is when Alan's story shifts to become more about a story of your survival. At the dead of night is where the game shines the brightest. Although it has its history with Max Payne games to thank for Alan Wake's overall gameplay, it is the use of light as a physical tool in combat and exploration that makes this game so much more interesting to me as a third-person survival horror shooter. In order to kill the hostile enemies, you need to burn the darkness off of them, then use your gun to finish the job. Although bullets for your revolver is damn near infinite at times, your flashlight is your real source of resource management stress. Bullets are quickly elaborated as useless in the opening section, and explain that there is a layer of darkness that protects them from mortal harm. Although you have generous amounts of bullets available to you, you won't have unlimited batteries at your command, and waiting for the battery gauge to refill itself between batteries is not always the safest bet, as you will remain open to attacks from enemies. It recontextualizes combat in a different way. Flashbang grenades behave more as lethal throwables in Alan Wake, instead of a stun method like in Call of Duty. Players offer breathing room and temporary safety as you catch your breath or traverse dangerous areas easier, much like a rappel in Pokemon games. And flare guns are your RPG-like weapons to take out large amounts of enemies. Not only does light affect how combat is contextualized, it also allows for better rewards for being observant to your surroundings. Often you will encounter paint that can only be visible when you point your flashlight at it. This is the guide the player to additional resources to assist in gameplay. This could be weapons, ammo, batteries, and anything that will help you better expand or supplement your current resources to help you survive the night. Light is just as much a weapon as it is a tool in ways other games don't do it. It's this mechanical rewiring of the player that makes you think before you shoot and panic more when you fall back to traditional methods of play. My fiance had to experience this for herself when I picked up the remaster for her to try. Although she went through the tutorial and eventually figured out the fundamentals of play and sequence broke some parts of the opening sequence on Diver's Isle, she would struggle between the established rewriting of how light and guns work in the game versus how games like Call of Duty or Resident Evil 7 would use light and guns. She would be spooked, but not admit it, and fail in panic as the shadowy figures attacked her and she shot them with no avail, forgetting almost how to play. It made me ponder more about how we looked at these elements in other major games relative to Alan Wake. Remember how I mentioned the manuscript pages prior? This is yet another interesting factor to how Alan Wake made me think about games and how to tell stories in an interactive medium. The manuscript pages are a sort of collectible that exists in the world and have narrative relevance and context. In short, the story in the manuscript pages is the incomplete story of the game itself. This allows for a survival-based reason to look around for this collectible, as it mentally prepares you for what it is ahead of you. This is where a great horror storytelling method is demonstrated. Tell a story, but not the complete story. For plot reasons and to avoid spoilers, it is enough to say that the final pages to the manuscript remain unfinished and the plot unresolved. To me, who was getting into horror, this was great. This allows me to mentally prepare for the events to come, only to see the reality of the situation is not as bad as I thought. It allowed for mental preparation and conditioning of the events of the game. However, the manuscript pages only tell a portion of the full lore of the game. This is where the game lingers in my mind, prompting contrasting and constant replays and revisit the Bright Falls. Some things that are beginning to establish a thread of logic quickly get cut off with contradiction and other loose lines of reasoning. For instance, late in the game, Alan had an autobiographical page about his childhood that Alan earlier shares in a flashback to his wife. Alan had a fear of the dark as a child and was given a disconnected light switch that would help him make things writing up. This was intentionally meant to be a child's tale to help Alan deal with the dark as a kid that was later referenced by Thomas Zane, the literal guiding light of the game. In this page he supposedly wrote, it is believed to be him that wrote this page because he was the only other author mentioned canonically in the game. You can reasonably believe that he had to have written this page when he was younger due to the Anderson brothers claiming to have a relationship with the poet-author. There is just some problems with that. The Anderson brothers are mentioned to have dementia, but may not actually be crazy like what Hartman claims, and Thomas Zane himself claims he didn't write the page, but then again, not much is known in-game about Thomas Zane himself. It is likely he did write that page, implying the real story is shrouded by darkness beneath the surface of this now fictional reality within a fictional reality. Thomas has yet to do anything to merit distrust due to how little problems he has caused from being deceitful to Alan. Yet not much is known about him in general, so we can't fully trust him either. This is the major point that brings my mind back into focus towards this game because it adds a Matrix-like level or surreal psychological horror as we now begin to think about what exactly is real and what exactly is going on. My love for horror began with a Steam sale. My horror journey continued and grew into a gloriously grotesque love of the dark side of storytelling. All it took was a step into the familiar yet shadowy territory to help me shape into who I am and how I examine the world. It made me happier and less fearful of the world as I better understand the depths of a good story. It was Alan Wake that opened my eyes to horror and darker forms of media. This game made me see the light in darker media.